mentioned earlier on that we're doing some truth bombing, and so here comes the neutron bomb. And so what I'm going to say here is going to be connected to what Harvey said there about standing, and certainly everything in here is going to do a lot to explain what led to the condition of the gentleman who came before me. I met him briefly, but I forgot his name. Joshua. Because we're living in a society that has many problems. One of the chief ones is this hypersexual culture we're living in. And now I'm going to show you why we live in that culture, how we end up there. So I'll begin with a slide from Edmund Burke. You probably heard this quote before. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Okay, so in short, if we don't do anything, it's not getting better. If you think it's bad now, just wait until you sit around and do nothing, and then see how totally rotten it can potentially get. This is true. Burke has wrote a lot of commenting on the French Revolution, and what he saw going in what was really a humanist revolution, which so many people continue to fawn over. But really the French Revolution has within it all kinds of things which we inspire people today, but it doesn't bring life. We need a revolution for sure, but we need the revolution of Christ in us and not the revolution of men, whoever they might be. What's this? A what? Wrong. Deceived first, out the gate, not very good. Okay, that's not a tank. That's a blow-up tank. All right. Deception. In the Second World War, the Allies were struggling with this gentleman. Who's that? It's Rommel. He was a military genius. Difficult to defeat in North Africa. And so what the Allies eventually did is they used kinds of strategies to beat this man because he was exceptional, a tremendous military genius. They would take vehicles and disguise them, put facades on them. In one of the battles, as I read, they knew where he was, and what you can do if you want to get an advantage militarily is get them to orientate themselves in the wrong direction. So they mounted facades onto the front of tanks to make them look like trucks, and did the same on trucks. And so Rommel, as he's looking at a distance through the field glasses, he can see, and so he thinks, okay, well, I've got a transport supply behind me. Let me get my gear around because they're coming from the south. And then this line of vehicles just turned around and drove off, but it was too late. Because by the time he turned around, those trucks were actually tanks. Military deception. In another situation, the Allies were taking a harbor, and you needed that scale of warfare. You need harbors because ships can carry the most cargo, and you need to bring a lot of equipment in. The problem is once you pull ships into harbor, they're concentrated, and the Germans can just sink the whole lot right there in the harbor. So what they did is they got the guys together, engineers, and said, right, what we want to do is want you to build like a fake harbor just a couple of miles down. We'll leave enough lights just to throw them off. And so when the German bombers come over, they won't bomb over the harbor. They'll drop all their ordnance just a couple of miles. And they fell for it. Genius. Deception. Here's the thing. We underestimate Satan. Because if you think men are good at deception, they've got nothing on Satan. He's the father of lies. Don't underestimate him, especially since he's been defeated. Because when people are defeated, they don't behave nicely. And he doesn't have your best interests at heart, I can rest assure you that. But he's a deceiver. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is a concept that is throughout the Bible. There's many texts which talk about the concept. But this passage from Corinthians is probably one of the most succinct. Because it describes the war that all of us are involved in. Everybody's a part of. Anybody who confesses Jesus, you're immediately in the battle. It says this, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. How does the world wage war? They build armies. We don't build armies. We don't gather weapons. We don't need weapons. We have one. It's called the Word of God. Okay. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. What? If I told you that I could put a weapon in your hand that has divine power, would you want that? Who wants a weapon with divine power? Yeah. Well, we all have it. You don't believe it. It's called the truth. That's what it is. Divine power. It even talks about this, how it works. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Spiritual warfare is fundamentally not a battle for power, because nobody fights God. It's a battle for truth. It's fundamentally what spiritual warfare is about. And if your mind is diseased and feeble, and you don't know how to handle truth or think well, it's not going to end well for you. It's not enough just to have big hearts for Jesus. We need to have minds that are alert and on fire. Jesus was not a clumsy, dull man. Go and look at the conversations he has with the religious leaders and the Pharisees. He knew exactly how to present an argument. He knew when people were making bad arguments, and he confronted with them. He often rebuked them or corrected them. Okay, and we need to exemplify that. I showed you this picture already. This is a picture of spiritual warfare in our times. We are living under the banner of the social justice movement, cultural Marxism. I showed you the picture. They want a certain political outcome, socialism. So you've got to have a cultural revolution first, and then you've got to go upstream to the institutions. There's the institutions. We spoke about the institutions and the three key ones: the university, the church, and family. We looked at Gramsci's quote. Okay, I'm not making this up. He said it. There's the game plan. What am I showing you? I'm showing you that spiritual warfare is not some vague, nebulous thing. Okay. There's a face to it. You see his face. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, Christian. Yeah, I'm telling you now, you may walk out of this building, you will know something most people don't. You know exactly what this war is all about and where it came from. And what we're going to do the rest of my talk is we're going to look at how this is focused specifically on the family, because the family is the most important of all the institutions. Why? Because what's the first institution? The family. Genesis. From family, you put families together, you get what? A church. Who built the universities? Churches. And once you do that, you build civilization. You destroy the family, the whole thing goes. The whole lot. I didn't create that structure. It's the Lord's. It begins in Genesis. We need to respect those creation ordinances. We need to prioritize creation ordinances. Our brother just spoke here about what happens to men who lose their families. What happens to their ministry and their witness? It's gone. It's over. Okay. And so the center of the board, the cherry, is the family. Now, maybe you think, well, this guy's a bit of a wild cat from Zimbabwe, and he's misrepresenting these intellectuals. Hopefully, by the end of this, you're going to see I'm not doing that. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is I'm going to quote from them, or I'm going to show you them saying it themselves. So let's listen to this straight out of the mouth of a social justice scholar. She wrote a book called Abolishing the Family. BLM, Abolishing the Family. Now you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. I want you to pay attention to what she's saying.
Abolition is about the proliferation of relationships of care, not a kind of destruction of the relationships we already have. Capitalism and capitalist states rely really heavily on the family as a unit of social discipline, social order, austerity, and a source of huge amounts of unpaid labor. In the history of feminism, abolishing the family was, very well known as a demand, particularly in the 60s and 70s amongst certain strands of women's liberation, including Shulamith Firestone's famous The Dialectic of Sex, where she talks about children's liberation and a world in which children and women would have much more autonomy over the households in which they live. It's feminists who have mounted an analysis of the private nuclear household as the site of the overwhelming majority of the rape and abuse that takes place on Earth. Family abolition means that we deserve more. We deserve more than the sort of blackmail that tells us that we must be content with relationships defined as blood or as nature, the relationships we find given to us. It means that we could develop forms of comradeliness, forms of chosen, or in the phrase of the xenofeminists, sort of xenofam. Xenofam can be as good as, at least as good as, relationships of sort of biological or biogenetic nature. So that's one way of thinking about abolition as a process of building and growing all the kind of forms of love and care and solidarity that we deserve.
The nuclear family is the site for the vast majority of rape and abuse in the world. Did you catch that? The nuclear family props up the capitalist structure. We spoke about that this morning. We need forms of comradeliness because the xenofeminists have said so. Why is she important? Because these are the scholars that they teach to your students in your social science departments, folks. Could it be that perhaps we dropped our guard and the condition of the family is because we did get lazy? But could it be that part of the chaos in our culture and the destruction of our family is because our universities teach this philosophy? I'm going to show you how that's true. Here she goes on to say her book, The Abolish the Family, talks about, she's a Marxist. No, they're all Marxists, by the way. Postmodernists, Marxists. She says that the abolition of family and economy is inseparable from the abolition is self-evident. She's referring back to Marx and Engels. Well, let's not represent them. Straight out of the Communist Manifesto. 3 red lines. Abolition of family. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. He goes on to say, do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty. Those parents are exploiting their children. It goes on to say, the bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parents and child becomes all the more disgusting. There you have it. This is what they feed people at UCT and UWC and Stellenbosch University. This is the reason why BLM, as I said, is against the family. Why? Because they're Marxists. What do they believe will happen? It will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis, and this way removes the 2 bases of traditional marriage, a dependence rooted in private property of the woman on the man and the children on the parents. That's right, state will educate your kids. We're fighting this battle now in our law courts. You better go and write about that freedom of speech bill, every single one of you. You need to say something, and then you need to send that thing on and irritate all your friends and say, do something about it. Because that's why they want to shut this down. They want to control the schools. Why? Because they're Marxists. How do you abolish the family? Attack biology, attack the concept of man, attack the concept of parental responsibility. the innocence of children, attack the concept of women, the concept of sex, make sex political, and finally attack the life of the unborn. Let's look at them attacking that. In her work called The Dialect of Sex, Shulamith Firestone is a celebrity feminist in the feminist movement in the 1970s. She wrote this book in which she said, look, Marx had some good ideas, and so did some of the cultural Marxists, but really they didn't go deep enough, because in a book she says that the problem is that there's a reality more fundamental than economics and culture. And what is it? Well, she says, there is a level of reality that does not stem directly from economics. We can develop a materialist view of history based on sex itself. The biological family is an inherently unequal power distribution. This is where the problem begins. That's why it's such a demand now for equality, because it's an unequal power distribution. This is where the feminists get this from. If you've been wondering what the feminists think, here they go. She says the natural reproductive difference between the sexes led directly to the first division of labor at the origins of class, as well as the furnishing of the paradigm of caste. The final statement sums up the whole affair. That's the triumph of the patriarchate, because now we've all got to say down with patriarchy, okay? Was neither a matter of chance nor the result of violent revolution. From humanity's beginning, their biological advantage has enabled males to affirm their status as the sole and sovereign subjects. So why have men dominated? Because biologically we are stronger. And who's responsible for that? The feminists are not just at war with men, they're ultimately at war with reality. Yeah. That's contemporary feminism for you in a nutshell. And nothing much has changed since then. That's right. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read this stuff. They actually hate this. Yeah. Yeah, we have it. This is why they're opposed to the binary. Because what does the binary do? It affirms maleness, anatomy and physiology, and femaleness. Our contemporary philosophy says the binary is oppressive. There's many different sexualities out there. You can go to UCT to learn all about it. Or you can join the Trans University Forum of South Africa, or you can become a part of the Trans Human Rights, Gender Dynamics, Africa-based public benefit organization. Here in the Western Cape, for you to join. These people are running the show. They're running our universities, driving the conversation in the culture. What about the attack on parental responsibility? This is a big one. This is maybe one of the most insidious statements I've ever read in my life on a critique of parents. Willem Reich says this: the suppression of the natural sexuality of the child, particularly of its genital sexuality, makes the child apprehensive, shy, obedient, afraid of authority, good, and adjusted. In the authoritarian sense, it paralyzes the rebellious forces because any rebellion is laden with anxiety. It produces, by inhibiting sexual curiosity and sexual thinking in the child, a general inhibition of thinking and critical faculties. In brief, the goal of sexual suppression is that of producing an individual who is adjusted to the authoritarian order and who will submit to it in spite of all misery and degradation. What is all that mumbo-jumbo about? In short, when I teach my boys about penises and what to do and not to do with them, and my wife teaches my daughters about their bodies and how to carry themselves, what am I doing? I'm suppressing them. You stop doing that. How do you stop doing that? The state teaches your kids on sexuality. Because what I'm doing is I'm making them to become little serfs that got suffering from false consciousness to be exploited by the capitalist authoritarian system. Goes on to say, at first the child has to adjust to the structure of the authoritarian miniature state, the family. That's the problem. It's the family is the problem. This makes it capable of later subordination to the general authoritarian system. So we need to get rid of this family structure, and we need to be the ones who teaches kids about sexuality, and we need to let them explore all their sexual behavior, because it makes for a great revolutionary. There's Willem Reich. attacking the innocence of children, the perversion of all of this. Yes, two real people who needed some real help, criminals, pedophiles, but in the academic world, these people are champions, quoted, institutions named and built after them, pedophiles, criminals, these men. We teach what do we teach at home? Or to teach abstinence. What did Alfred Kinsey say? The only kind of sexual dysfunction are abstinence, celibacy, and delayed marriage. What we want is a culture that's liberated. We want promiscuity everywhere for our children. You're living in that. This gentleman's confession was partly as a result of that carnage. That's what the whole porn industry is about. Do whatever you want. Attacking the concept of women. This is a big one now that's come up recently. Okay? Because apparently now you can't define what a woman is. Here's an interview with a bunch of people grilling a woman who's now Ketanji Brown on the Supreme Court bench in the United States, which makes her one of the top 9 judges in America. Let's see if I can get this. Well, let's hear what she has to say.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition? No,
Yeah.
I can't.
You can't?
Not in
Okay.
this context.
So you
I'm not
believe
a
the
biologist.
meaning of the word woman is so unclear and controversial that you can't give me a definition?
Senator, in my work as a judge, what I do is I address disputes. If there's a dispute about a definition, people make arguments, and I look at the
All right.
law and I decide.
Well,
so I'm not.
The fact that you can't give me a straight answer about something as fundamental as what a woman is underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive education that we are hearing about.
Wow.
Hey, thanks for watching.
Rhetorically weak. We need to learn as Christians to pitch this stronger. We've discussed this with friends of mine. What you really want to ask her is first is, do you believe in women's rights? To which no doubt she's probably going to say. And then ask her, what is a woman? And when she complains and whines, ask her, what are you? Folks, we laugh. Top 9 judges. Our judiciary swallowing the same stuff. She didn't get this. She didn't get this concept from her legal teaching. She got this from the philosophy department, from people like Judith Butler, because it's people like Judith Butler who've given us our new definitions of sex and sexuality. She says in her book here, Gender Trouble, she says, page 1, she says, recently this prevailing conception of the relation between feminist theory and politics has come under challenge from within feminist discourse. The very subject of woman is no longer understood in stable or abiding terms. There is a great deal of material that not only questions the viability of the subject as the ultimate candidate for representation or indeed liberation, but there's very little agreement, after all, on what it is that constitutes or ought to constitute the category of woman. The reason why we can't define what a woman is because Judith Butler and her social justice academics have said so. That's why. And they're the ones running your social science departments. Well, if you can't define what a woman is, then what follows from that? If the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence being that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. By page 7, it's over and done with. Sex is a social construct. That's right. Apparently, penises and vaginas don't matter. It's got nothing to do with it. It's all just a social construct. Why? Because they said so. That's why we've got men running against girls, and we don't know what to do at the toilets anymore. Well, it's not happening over there. Oh, here's Northwest University, you know, that bastion of conservatism. Gender Awareness Week, okay? Here's an abstract from a lecture presented. This research aims to fulfill the long-existing gap in Afrikaans queer-identifying women and non-binary individuals' specific way of queering language as an expression of their identity and lived experiences. there we go, for all you Afrikaans people. So where Afrikaans culture is going. Yeah, here we here. This is going to be interesting. Furthermore, the idea of performativity introduced by Judith Butler will also be used to support the notion, just like gender. Folks, our universities are just copying and pasting whatever comes out of America and Europe and running it here in South Africa. Same thing. Same scholars, same arguments, same pablum. And it's why we've got this going on. But it gets worse than this. Okay, we can go back to 1984 to the work of Gail Rubin, one of the largest celebrities in the queer theory movement. In fact, her paper called Thinking Sex, written in 1984, is considered to be the landmark paper and the foundation of queer theory studies programs. She wrote the first paper in 1984. She's the one who argues. She says most radical thought about sex has been embedded within the model of instincts and their restraints. Concepts of sexual oppression have been lodged within a more biological understanding of sexuality. That's what we all believe, that biology has something to do with it. She says it's often easier to fall back on the notion of the natural libido subjected to inhumane repression than to reformulate concepts of sexual injustice within a more. There it is. So this was beginning way before Butler. This is 1984. Constructivist framework. But it is essential we do so. Then she goes and says, we need a radical critique of sexual arrangements that has the conceptual elegance of Michel Foucault and Willem Reich. We just heard what Willem said. He was the guy saying that parents shouldn't teach their sexuality. They draw their inspiration from these criminals and perverts, of which Foucault was one. Foucault is the word in philosophy departments in South Africa. But it gets worse than that. A couple of months ago, this came up on social media. It was a meme. It said, there's some people are child lovers, get over it. And I posted this, and people said, you know, the LGBT community would never affirm this now because this is basically endorsing pedophilia. Au contraire. Because in that same paper, Gail Rubin says this, talking about the concept of sexuality. She says this, the experience of art photographer Jacqueline Livingston exemplified the climate created by the child porn panic. An assistant professor of photography at Cornell University, Livingston was fired in 1978 for exhibiting pictures of male nudes, which included photographs of a 7-year-old son masturbating. She goes on to say, it is easy to see why someone like Livingston, as a victim of the child porn wars, it is harder for most people to sympathize with actual boy lovers. Like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, let alone their erotic orientation. Consequently, the police have feasted on them. Local police, the FBI, the watchdog postal inspectors have joined to build a huge apparatus whose sole aim is to wipe out the community of men who love underage youth. In 20 years or so, when some of the smoke is cleared, it'll be much easier to show that these men have been the victims of a savage and undeserved witch hunt. A lot of people will be embarrassed by their collaboration with this persecution, but it'll be too late to do much good for those men who have spent their lives in prison. What is she arguing for? Pedophilia. These are the academic papers that our students read in our universities. I said to you, what about the EFF? Our universities are feeding this philosophy to the culture that is now making an argument for pedophilia. And don't get too, these people are so irritated about child pornography. She says, the laws produced by the child porn panic are ill-conceived and misdirected. They represent far-reaching alterations in the regulations of sexual behavior and abrogate important sexual civil liberties, but hardly anyone noticed as they swept through the Congress and register, with the exception of the North American Man-Boy Love Association and the ACLU. NAMBLA is an organization that exists in the United States. It's been around since the 70s. But hey, Stellies can do it for you. We need queer activism in South African education, disrupting cis-heteronormativity in schools. Let Stellenbosch come and help your schools get your ideas on sexuality sorted out for you. Or News 24, how about this? Yeah, tongues and other to is why queer sex ed is good for everyone. Or how about having queer theory in our law schools? Here, this is University of Pretoria, Law Press, queer lawfare. Okay? Or maybe we can get the law involved. We saw this with the LoveKey Church. Because apparently, you have to be gay to know God, and then you can win the Andrew Murray Book Prize. In our curriculums, here we go. In South Africa, CSE, we all heard about this. African culture, transgenderism. Making sex political. This was begun by Herbert Marcuse and his crowd. They understood that if you can control everything around the issue of sex, you can control the whole culture, and they are right, folks. We are living in that climate. There's not a single man here that hasn't been affected by this. They are running the show. Marcuse in the 1960s, look at that statement there. Today, the fight for life, the fight for eros, is the political fight. He writes this paper in late 1960s. He says, I propose the practice of discriminating tolerance. It can, under the prevailing conditions of tyranny, be won only by the sustained effort of radical minorities willing to break this tyranny and work for the emergence of a free and sovereign majority. Minorities intolerant, militarily intolerant, and disobedient to the rules of behavior. The 60s sexual revolution was not just about kids misbehaving and wanting to have sex. The 60s sexual revolution was a cultural Marxist revolution to overthrow America and other nations wherever it struck itself and supplant it with the cultural Marxist. How do we know that? Because Herbert Marcuse was the ideas behind this. Okay? And this is what they did. He was the champion. He was the celebrity behind the 60s movement. Okay? He writes this in the 1960s. The left has no equal voice, no equal access to the mass media and their public facilities, not because a conspiracy excludes it, but because in good old capitalist fashion it doesn't have the required purchasing power, and the left does not have the purchasing power because it is in the left. That was written in 1968. 5 decades, 50 years. They've got all the media. Elon Musk kind of ruined the Twitter party. But apart from that, which media outlet doesn't agree with this? It took them 50 years, folks, while we were sleeping. They took over the universities, Gramsci, they got the whole lot. You are all living in the world of Herbert Marcuse, whether you like it or not. Here he is discipling Angela Davis. Here's a clip from him at Berkeley University in the 1960s with the disciple Angela Davis.
We have to talk about a complete and total change in the structures of this society, because that's the only way that a concept like academic freedom is going to be made relevant. We have to go to the streets. The Berkeley campus has perhaps the most unique tradition of political activity. You have continually assumed the political responsibility of responding to acts of repression and have been capable of involving the masses of the students on this campus in demonstrative political actions. If only for this reason, I feel very proud to be able to speak to you today.
What Angela Davis had to say here at UC Berkeley was no different from what many other radicals have said. Her only problem seems to be that she's given herself a label. She calls herself a member of the Communist Party. Velva Davis for Eyewitness News, UC Berkeley.
Look at the size of this crowd.
They didn't have to identify themselves as pigs, because anyone on the street caught from this moment forward molesting anyone you did who doesn't have on a sentence to 9 months imprisonment and 3 years probation. The racist hunky dog judge sit up there.
Yes,
I believe that the fight is just beginning to start. The fight against all those who want to make your university.
There's the connection, folks. 1960s, he was the main man behind it. He said we need to take all these minority groups, African Americans and homosexuals, and make them militant, intolerant to the rules of behavior, militarize them. And then he trained up the leading social justice thinkers, people like this. It's fed to us through organizations like USAID. Here we go. Thank you, America, for helping us. By the way, our CSE program was drafted by UNESCO and funded by the USAID. Thank you very much to Americans. How about the Europeans? Europeans are really helping out because they think us in Africa, we're all backwards. So they write documents to help NGOs and government organizations implement progressive ethics in third world backward countries. So they conveniently get together a bunch of legal entities from these countries who write these documents that then get disseminated to help NGOs make us all become progressive, funded by the EU. Thank you very much. So much for the decolonization in Africa. It's out with colonialism, in with Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a European. How is that decolonizing anything? I said to these EFF guys when I was talking to them, well, we're all about decolonization. Okay, what do you mean by that? Well, we want to get rid of Eurocentric influence. Okay, so why are you wearing a Frenchman's hat? What's with the beret? What's with the beret? What's with the communist red? Karl Marx was a German Jew. What's African about Marxism? Nada, zilch. And yet, all our decolonization talk in all our universities is saying we're getting rid of European colonialism by feeding me what? Karl Marx? We need to teach Christians to point out this problem. It's pretty self-evident if you stop and think about it for 2 seconds. But it doesn't end there, because this is the last and final way, the ultimate way to destroy family. And if ever there's a demon in the house, when this spirit shows up, we need to be praying. In the 1920s, before the West had its sexual revolution, because in the West we always tend to think we were first. In the 1920s, the Russians had already had their sexual revolution. In fact, they used to call themselves progressives back then. This is what Putin is doing now to gee up the Russians. He says, these morons in Europe, they used to call themselves progressives. We were progressives before them. How do we know that? You can go and read the literature. Because before the famous feminists of the West, like Simone de Beauvoir and other people like Shulamith Firestone were even on the scene, the Russian girls had said it all. Anti-family, promiscuous society. Alexandra Kollontai, the woman behind me, talks about this. The idea of marriage forever is a contradiction to all that psychological scientists know about how the psyche changes during the long course of a human's life. The demand made by contemporary morality deserves to be laughed at. Each person must at all costs find their happiness. She, together with the team, were the first people to get together and have the first nation on the face of the planet to legalize abortion. First nation, 1920. How many babies have the Russian aborted since 1920? 260 million. In the 60s, they were aborting on average about 6 million a year. They had the sexual revolution. Didn't go too well for them. They paid a tremendous price when you play with bad ideas. What is that? What is that? What is that? Look. Don't look away. Look. I got a friend of mine who fights abortion in this country. Couldn't find one church in this country to stand by him to go to the Supreme Court. Cowards. Let there be no cowards here amongst you. who profess Christ. Are you a coward? You need to be propped up in your chair because your spine fell at your back? Hey? Can't get a voice for these little people. What's wrong with us? What's wrong with us? Folks, it's time to wake up. We are in a dark place now, and I've shown you this stuff. I have to read this literature. I don't think it's good for my soul, too much of it, but somebody better read it. I'm coming to warn you and to tell you that if you don't do anything, it's not going to get better. We're going to need some Christian men to start standing up in this nation. Because if this is true, and we love the Jesus, we ought to respond. Because if we don't respond, what does that say about us? That's what this conference is about. And now maybe you think to yourself, gosh, I can't read all that stuff. I don't know that heady stuff. You don't need to. You don't need to. Why? Because we've all different parts of the body. Some of us need to be in those arenas. God has me there. I'll do my job. Africa and Rayon Smith from Cause for Justice. There's an organization worth supporting. That man on the left there, stand up, Ryan. You go and get his number. He's with Cause for Justice. He's been fighting the porn industry in this country. He's been helping parents fight for decent sexual ethics in our schools. You need to find out you go and get his number, every single one of you, and support his organization. He needs support. He needs a bigger team. You need to start doing that now. You start prioritizing that your son plays first team rugby for Paul Jim is of what consequence eternally? Big fat zero. What, you're going to find yourself riding the stupid Cape Epic? I mean, I like riding mountain bikes and things, but are you serious? So many people distracted with things that are of no consequence. Nothing. Nada, zilch. We have to wake up. And we need to be praying like nothing else against this evil. I have no other word for that. Satanic evil. Telling women it's okay to butcher your own children, and that way you'll be liberated. What? I mean, what a great lie, if ever there was one. Yeah, you'll be really liberated and freed by butchering your own child. Here's one slide for the whole conference. Because you might ask yourself, well, what am I going to do about this? And I'm going to close on this slide now. Because I've been wrestling with that. We need pastors like Heinz who have strong families. If you've got weak families in churches, church is a nightmare. So what we need to do now is we need to mobilize, and we all need to start where it all begins in Genesis 2. Okay, so let's take, what do you do for a living, sir? Entrepreneur. He's a businessman. He works in the corporate world. What's your name? Francois. Francois over there in the corporate world. Now, what can Francois do? Well, he needs to live like Christ in his corporate world. But if Francois' family life is a nightmare, it ain't any good. First point of call, if you're married, you need to go back home and love your wife. And if you have kids, teach them Christianity. From that, we can then build strong churches. We can't do anything meaningful unless we get those two things right. Why? Because this is God's creation. Okay. We go upstream, wherever you are. If you're Frick from Nikak in the Free State on the farm, in your car keys, I say to him, go home and love your wife. Teach your kids. There is nothing more destructive to this ideology of our age than going home and teaching basic Christianity and Christian ethics to your children. And they know that. That's why they're trying to tear it down. They understand this better than we do. I have shown you what real spiritual warfare looks like in our country now, not just here, but in many nations. And I've said to you, here's what we can do about it. You can all go back home and be a good son or a good brother and protect your sisters from this nightmare that the view of women is not going to be given to them by the feminists. God tells women who they are and what they're for because He made them. And He tells you the same thing. That's why this has to do with God. Because how they get rid of truth is they feed you postmodern skepticism and say there is no truth. And then they redefine what love is. What is love? Whatever you want. Those are non-negotiables. And from here, we have a chance. A chance. I'm in the university. I can do great work in the university with my team. But if we do great work in the university and the families are falling apart and the church is going nowhere, it's all for naught. God has helped us to think as a ministry about what we need to do to help local churches. How I can help clients is to come to a men's conference and share this information on what true spiritual warfare looks like. And then to call you to action. There are ministries here. There are organizations here. You need to start prioritizing it. You need to go back home. If you've given your kids a smartphone, take it into the garage and hit the front of that screen with a hammer. Okay? Go back and buy them an analog phone. You know those old ones? Because the kid doesn't need to be flicking through a screen. What do you think, they're not going to learn technology? Is this learning technology just sitting there? No, it's a big portal for all kinds of sewage coming into their lives through TikTok and everything else, and they're too young to process it. If you want to teach them technology, then sit down with them and show them how the device works. Show them what a spreadsheet is or a database or whatever that thing is. But don't delude yourself into thinking that you're okay with your teenage girl there sitting down and watching contemporary, transgender feminists or Taylor Swift singing this philosophy to them. Take charge of your family, because if you can't take charge of your family, you have no business speaking to the world.